Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Jen Rickson. I work here at the Circulation Department here at the library. Hello to everyone and welcome to today's presentation. Before we start, just a little bit of business for you. After the presentation, we have program evaluations. So we welcome you to fill out a program evaluation, let us know how we did, and any other future programs you'd like to see. So again, welcome to today's presentation, The Boston-China Connection, A Personal Journey of Discovery, presented by Tom Paine. Over his career as a landscape architect, Wellesley resident Tom Paine has spent 2 years working in Asia, a year in Taiwan in the 1970s, and a year in Shanghai in 2008, with numerous subsequent working visits. His bilingual book on sustainable and accessible public open space design, Cities with Heart, was published in Beijing in 2015. This presentation also delves into Tom's family connection to the old China trade, which was formative in the relationship between China and America. So, without further ado,
Thank you, Jen. Thank you. Well, welcome one and all. It's a pleasure to see all of you here, and I think that you'll find that a group of this size allows for a dialogue if we want to have that after my remarks complete. So I do hope that this triggers some questions, because this is a really, it should be on, but let us, testing 1, 2, 3. Can people hear that? Is this loud enough? Great. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here. When Kara Rothman approached me, I guess in the early spring about speaking here, because Wellesley has had a book reading of Jishen's novel, and that seemed to prompt the idea that Wellesley is long overdue in having some programs that relate to the China-American experience. Through John Durham of the Wellesley Historical Society, Carol was alerted to this, and so here I am. So for better or for worse, over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a personal journey of China in this moment in our interaction of nations between a robust modern China and a sort of troubled modern America. In this moment of time, I'm going to take you on both sides of the Taiwan Strait as a landscape architect, beginning my journey when I was a 28-year-old practicing landscape architect. Now let's just see if I can go in the right direction here. Except, I go down maybe. So I guess, gentlemen, need your help. But my journey begins.
So you just want to use the left and right arrows.
The right arrows? Not doing it. Beautiful. Okay, so I won't mess with the cursor. My journey begins before I was born with my great aunt, who went to China in the period of the Chinese Revolution in 1911. She was there both before it and after it, taking tens of thousands of images. She was an artist, and from some of her images, she was able to create just amazing charcoal drawings of just regular folks in China. I love this drawing. I didn't even discover, though, that she was there in the right place at the right time in 1912 to 13. She's the only person in this view who has a camera. All the other Western dignitaries are tipping their hats to a gentleman who's tipping his hat. Guess who he is? Anybody know? Chan. This is Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the president of modern China, who's just completed a revolution and has been elected president of modern China, and he's totally inspired by Western ideas of how to introduce democratic government to China. I had no idea this photograph even existed until about 5 years ago, when I was going through the contact sheets of my great aunt and found this. And I've shown it in Guangzhou, as will become clearer when that moment took place later in my talk. But the year before Sun Yat-sen's revolution, there was a personal connection between Boston and Sun Yat-sen. When he came to Boston and spent a night in the Freemasons' townhouse on Tyler Street in Boston's Chinatown, there ought to be a historic plaque on this building. There isn't. But he was raising money for his revolution. He was going all over America collecting money for the revolution that then unfolded a year later in 1911. But he was not only collecting money, he was collecting ideas, because over his education in Hawaii and his visits to America, he was in Chicago and elsewhere, Sun Yat-sen became aware of the immortal words of Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, which ends with, as we all know, of the people people, for the people. And these words, which is to go right back to Boston, because Lincoln himself borrowed these words, and people don't realize this, from the Transcendentalist before this war. Part of the abolitionist movement used the words, and he's applying to all people, the words of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. And so these words, by way of Abraham Lincoln, totally inspired Sun Yat-sen, Sanminjuyi, which are three principles of the people. They are nationalism of the people, that's Minju; democracy, that's by the people, that's Mintran; and livelihood, that's for the people, that's Minsheng. So those are his three principles of the people, and they were embedded in the modern Chinese constitution that's still in effect in Taiwan, and was in effect in mainland China right up to 1949, when the communists drove out the nationalist government that Sun Yat-sen had been the first president of when they fled to Taiwan. But that's not the only way that our worlds are connected. It's also about the ideas that link us together, because so many kids in China in school, get this, they're reading Henry David Thoreau. The woman in the front of this photo, in the orange outfit, this is her first day ever outside of China. She was in the design firm that I was working with at the time, based in Shanghai. She'd never been outside of China, but she is a 14-year-old girl in a rural hillside community outside of Chengdu in central China, had read Henry David Thoreau's Walden, both in translation and in English. And of course, some of us remember that Thoreau was familiar with Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, and that's included, that Chinese thought is included there. It totally struck this young woman, and she wrote her undergraduate thesis on it later. And it was my pleasure to take her and others from our company to go visit Walden soon after this picture was taken at the Old Manse, at the Old North Bridge. You all have been there with that sign talking about Hawthorne, whom she also knew. When I took her to the Thoreau's cabin site with a big pile of rocks, ran away meeting this young woman in front. Near before the rocks, she said, "Henry, you don't know me, but I've known you since I was a 15-year-old girl." So that speaks to me that young people in China are reading and understanding and being moved by American Western thought and ideas. And of course, it begs the question, so what are we doing about Chinese ideas over here? But that's a conversation for another time. Anyway, throughout China, in my travels there, I was just struck by just what I was just seeing, just randomly. I mean, whether it's on a T-shirt or on a scooter, there's just things going on in China, and I think it's probably still going on in this post-COVID world, that relate to an understanding and appreciation of, broadly speaking, Western and American ideas. But it even drills down into the historians in China, like this woman, Fan Xiaoqing, who is Chinese in the American-China trade. And so I met her in 2014, more about that later. But they're studying, without any filters, they're looking at the opium, they're looking at the China trade, and they're saying, this is important history, we need to know this. Here we are, we get along. This is how it came about. And that was news to me, that we could have that kind of conversation about those kind of contentious historical moments. And so I would submit that our two worlds, you have China and America, they're like a Venn diagram. And if you look at this Chinese garden motif from the garden in Suzhou, it's like a Venn diagram. It's these two overlapping worlds. And I'm an optimist. I say in the long term, that overlap is going to grow. It's not going to shrink. It's going to grow. At the moment, it's shrinking a little bit, but it's going to grow back. That's my long-term take. So those are the broad brush strokes of what I want to talk to you about for the rest of my talk. My learning about all these things goes back 4 decades, or I suppose if maybe I go back to the 4th grade. So if you'll see the guy in the middle dressed up as a coolie with a coolie hat on, that's me in the 4th grade. We're doing China, and I don't know what we know, but we got the right costumes on. But what we did know were 2 words. Those words are Kimoi and Matsu. Kimoi and Matsu. Those of us who grew up in that area remember the names of these 2 islands that are right off the coast of mainland China that were still in the hands, not of the Chinese communists who ran mainland China, but in the hands of the nationalists who were on Taiwan, 100 plus miles away from these 2 islands. Kimoi and Matsu. So those names stuck with me over the years. When I got to college and after that and decided to become a landscape architect and went to the Graduate School of Design, one of my colleagues was Paul Sun. Paul Sun, who's no longer with us, was a great architect at Shepley Bulfinch architecture firm in Boston. His father accepted the Japanese surrender. So he was a nationalist general who fled to Taiwan, where Paul was raised, spent his youth before coming to the United States and training as an architect. And then he's a lifelong learner like myself. And so here in mid-career, he comes to the design school to pick up landscape architecture to add to his things. I met him there, and he becomes important later in the story. So just remember, Paul Sun. So 2 years, I worked in Boston as a landscape architect for 2 years when my wife, my much better half, Lynn, won a Henry Luce Foundation Fellowship to go to Asia, which sends 15 of the best and brightest whose only qualification is you get to go there, but you have to be totally ignorant about Asia. That's why they're sending you to learn, because this is in the post-Vietnam War era where we made so many mistakes making assumptions about things Asian. She wanted, us spouses also got to go. And so in 1976, in the year of the nation's bicentennial, the Henry Luce Foundation sent Lynn, her spouse, and 14 other Luce scholars to Hong Kong to disperse throughout Asia. The day that we arrived in Hong Kong, Mao Zedong died. This is August of 1976. This is the year of our nation's bicentennial. It was also the year that Mao died. And we were riveted by what we saw on the Holiday Inn television on our 25th floor room. We saw this. This is an image that I collected, but this is what I remember seeing. The wailing, the absolute grief of ordinary Chinese people running by or walking by, being shuffled along in front of the remains of Mao Zedong. He was a revered helmsman of China, whose reputation over time has become a more mixed bag, I guess we could say, to use that terminology. But for that year in Taiwan, after that incredible moment where other scholars went to the Philippines or Indonesia or wherever else, we went to Taiwan. We couldn't go to mainland China. It was off limits to Americans in 1976-7. So our choice for absorbing Chinese culture, Lynn's choice, my choice, our choice, was to go to Taiwan. And it turned out that Paul Sun had worked for the Tourism Bureau, where I got a job as a landscape architect, because this fellowship meant you work and you have a job and you work. You're not there to study, you're there to work. And I was a landscape architect and I wanted to do cultural preservation. And so I worked at the Tourism Bureau, working even on a replica of a building that's in Beijing that I never thought I'd have a chance to see, the Tiantong. Well, the developer guy on the left there was actually, he made a fortune in selling fortune cookies or something like that. And he wanted to do a kind of take off the temple in Beijing that amalgamated all the major world religions. And so my job was to create a landscape that went with that. The gentleman in the center with me from the Tourism Bureau was Jimmy Wong, a dear friend. We used to drink Johnny Walker together. He was born in Shanghai, and he fled with the nationalists to Taiwan. At the end of that year, where I just had a hell of a time, wonderful time, there was a little ceremony that took place. You can see images of a whole bunch of people in leisure suits. That's what people wore, not only in China back then. But you see me standing in the middle with not my leisure suit on, and Lynn, my better half, to the right of me there. Jimmy Wong, who's in the upper photograph to the far right. And the Director General of the Tourism Bureau is writing calligraphy. He's writing an inscription. It's his sort of improv poetry, and he's writing it out to me, saying, "Tom, we love what you did," and it involved cherry blossoms and bamboo and things like that. On the other photograph shows me and all my colleagues of the Technical Services Division of the Tourism Bureau, two of whom became lifelong friends. Rachel Lee called me her mentor. She taught landscape architecture. And Xu Wensheng, this guy became the Director General himself 30 years later and invited me back to Taiwan. Between those two visits, I got to go back another time when I was a business school student at Darden and did a marketing study for the Tourism Bureau in between the first visit and the last visit. But the continuity of Taiwan is what's extraordinary. This is Chinese culture that has not been run over or trampled into the dust, or however I could better phrase that. It has been respected. This is a bastion of traditional Chinese culture, which means respect for all the major early Chinese religions, Confucianism, which has come back in mainland China, but Taoism, Buddhism, those kinds of things, and the architecture, the Cultural Revolution, which some of you remember in your lifetime, and others of you have heard about, the Cultural Revolution, the great proletarian Cultural Revolution, was mainland China. It did not affect Taiwan at all. So they were just different worlds. Taiwan was saying, okay, we stand for traditional Chinese values. But they did not then, at that time, stand for democracy. That's what's happened since then. They evolved into a democracy. That's the extraordinary thing. But when we were there was censorship. If you had a Life magazine, they'd snip the article that said unkind things about Chinese culture or whatever. During that incredible year, Lynn and I both studied traditional Chinese culture, shall we say. My wife is the woman on the far left of the left-hand image. Between her and the young woman dressed in yellow, who is an American Chinese also visiting Taiwan, is their dance master, their dance instructor named Cai Riyue. More about her later. Anyway, she was the sort of premier female dance person in Taiwan at the time. And on the right, yes, that's my wife, and she's nailed that ribbon dance. She's totally nailed it. I don't know how you do that, except I got to say, my wife, when she was a kid, she was a champion baton twirler, like that. So I'm thinking that may have something to do with it. It was just in her genes, but you couldn't put me out there and come up with anything at all watchable. So what I did on Sunday mornings was go take Chinese painting lessons from a guy who was dressed in white, and he had a white piano. I always thought, this guy's like Liberace. He was teaching me Chinese painting. So the painting on the left is one that I did when I was in his class. That's my calligraphy. That's my Chinese chop with my Chinese name. Oh, by the way, what my name is Pan De Ming, which Pan sounds like pain. De means virtue, and Ming, it means bright. So Tom, Bright, Virtue, Pain. Close enough. On the right is a painting in that style that I did on Cape Cod. That's Nauset Beach. This is done in Chatham, Turn Island. It's sort of, we used to have a family house there, and I just kind of exaggerated the landscape, and I love the way Chinese traditional painting of pine trees goes, so I just did that. And I did a lot of these paintings. While we were there, we also hosted a group from what used to be called the Museum of the American China Trade, which was founded by the guy shown on the right there, Crosby Forbes. He's a direct descendant of some of the major China traders from Boston. And he founded this amazing museum, which is now called the Forbes House Museum. More about that later, but it was fun to take them around Taiwan because they weren't allowed to go to mainland China, which they, I guess, would have preferred to go to. So we went on down side streets in Taichung, sort of a mid-sized city halfway down the island, and just mingling with local people, doing things of that sort. But this is the 1970s. And so when we took a trip, Lynn and I, to another country nearby, in northern Thailand, we got to see things that were like a National Geographic article, the way I look at it. We got to see minorities, and this is the way they were living far off an electrified grid, no vehicles around. We were all just camping out and seeing sights like that I'll never forget, because I'm pretty sure all of that's gone now. But I had a double take, in Nanjing, in China, in 2012, when some kids in Chinese kids, those are Karen minority. They're not Chinese, but they're from Southeast Asia. But something about the way they're carrying each other, the way, you just don't see American kids do that. There's a cultural difference. Fascinating. I don't know how to describe it. But anyway, that was my take on it. I mentioned Paul Sun, who was a classmate of mine at the GSD, Shepley Bullfinch architect. Well, in the 1980s, when I was busy practicing landscape architecture and raising kids and things of that sort, and going to business school, Paul Sun got himself funded to go to mainland China to try to capture images of what he considered the fast disappearing vernacular architecture. I was completely unaware of these photographs until a year ago, and I joined this organization, and I was giving a talk about China, and one of the other members of the organization said, well, Paul Sun's got a whole bunch of slides of China, and we're trying to figure out what to do with them. So Tom, you know more about it than the rest of us. You go through them all, and then we'll see about who gets them. They're now in the hands of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. But while I had a chance to look at these slides, I found these amazing slides of what it was like to be in Western China in the 1980s. You won't see that anymore. But this is exactly in the same part of China, Xinjiang, I guess. It's also the country of the Urumqi, the minority that's sort of under under surveillance and control now. This is that part of China. But I think some of these images are not Urumqi, they're Han Chinese in that part of China. But this is an amazing collection of images that I hadn't even seen until I was going through them last year. But I thought this is the way to capture how far China has come since the 1980s, over my lifetime. In 1988, Lynn and I had a chance to go to Beijing, to go to mainland China for our first time. And we were guests of the Henry Luce Foundation, and we had a wonderful kind of photographic moment with then President of China, Li Xianyan, in the Great Hall of the People off of Tiananmen Square. And we got to, it was limited as to where we could go in China, but we got to go to see the Great Wall, and there I am horsing around on the Great Wall. But also, I got to go to see Qiantang, that temple that I mentioned earlier, that I worked on a replica of for that fortune teller, magnate, investor guy in Taiwan. I got to see the real thing for the first time in 1988. This is the year of the dragon, when our daughter was born. So I was wondering, when am I ever going to go to China next? Well, I had to wait a while before I found out. The first thing that led me in that direction happened in 2005, when that guy that was in the Tourism Bureau in the Technical Services Division with me that I pointed to, Director General of the Bureau, and he said, Tom, please come back to Taiwan. You're a landscape architect. Please consult on 21 tourist destinations and give us your advice as to their ecological, historical, whatever management, programming, or just design issues. And we'll give you 20 days to do it. It was fabulous. I was back and I was thinking to myself, wow, so I didn't age out? I mean, I'm still relevant to practicing in Asia? Well, this is kind of cool. So back I went. And I mentioned those islands of Quemoy and Matsu earlier for a reason, because in 2005, I went out to Quemoy and Matsu, which are now tourist destinations. So they keep the camouflage paint freshened and all the rest of it. But here we're still just 2 miles off the coast of mainland China. This is a tourist destination for Taiwanese tourists to go to. And there are some tourists going there. And I was consulting on other kinds of historic sites, a couple of pictures of me on the job in China. In Taiwan, I should say, in 2005. But the thing that really moved me was something that I did not get to see back when it was off limits to anybody except political prisoners back in 1976. This is the political prison island named Ludao, or Green Island, in Taiwan, which in the unfolding years, as Taiwan became democratic, amazing things started to happen. People that had been imprisoned there for being politically incorrect, and then some, had become the leaders of modern Taiwan, including the Harvard-educated Annette Lu and the president of Taiwan, Chen Shui-bian. These are two people that were incarcerated here, not in this structure. This structure here that I'm showing you is not the prison. This is a memorial wall based on Maya Lin's work on the Vietnam Memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. This is an inscription wall, not with the names of the dead, but the names of the incarcerated. And on the right there, you can see, I hope you can see, I hope it shows up, the inscribed names. It's a limestone wall, but I hope you can also see that 2 of those names are smudged. The white, the limestone, someone's been touching these things a lot, and they've smudged it, because those are the names of, I need somebody to help me translate it, but I think it's Annette Lu and Chen Shui-bian, but I could be wrong. Oh, the mayor of Kaohsiung? Yeah, okay. Other famous people who later went on to public service who have been incarcerated here. So here's the important point. Taiwan has owned up to mistakes it's made in the past and has made them into tourist attractions where people can go to become better informed about their very complicated history. Very interesting moment in their evolution.
Hey, Tom, I just have to interject for 1 second. It reminds me of Nelson Mandela's 25 years on Robben Island.
Exactly right.
It's a very similar story.
Exactly right. And I would love to go to Robben Island. It is also a tourist destination, and people, you have to get reservations to go there.
I would see the difference is that these people made Taiwan a better place. Mandela, after that,
He hasn't done, well, his
Okay,
successors haven't done
moving
so
on.
well.
Save that one for later. Okay, so let's go on to this. So basically, a year after that, all our kids were out the door, and Lynn and I said, well, let's just, what's the next exciting thing that can happen in life? And I applied for working in an overseas design firm. And by the far and away, the most desirable choice was from Wellesley resident Ma Xiaowei and his firm Ager Inc., a Chinese landscape architecture and urban planning firm based in Shanghai with then an office in Beijing. And over I went and spent an incredible year living in Shanghai, going all over China as a director of design of the firm. Shanghai is also the place where, along the waterfront, the Bund, along the Huangpu waterfront, you can see the last headquarters, the second building from the left on the waterfront of Russlin Company, the China trader. So the Russlin Company, this is somehow connected to John Forbes Carey. John Kerry's grandfather was born in Shanghai, or there's a Shanghai Russell and Company connection with John Forbes Carey. So, and that name Forbes relates back to the China trader Forbes. So Shanghai has an interesting backstory that connects back to Boston. So there I was working in this design firm all over China, very kind of diverse firm. The founder of the firm is on the upper left. That's Ma Xiaowei. And to his right would be myself and an eclectic bunch of designers. But this gives you a feeling for a Chinese design firm's leadership in trying to bring the best ideas into China, doing urban park projects, residential projects, just public works, private works for the leading developers in China and also the many cities throughout China. But amazingly, while I was working on all these new fun projects, I was also seeing out of the corner of my eye amazing traditional Chinese manifestations that would have just, my great aunt could have said, I saw exactly the same thing. Cormorants on a fishing, photographs of that. So some of these traditional things just continue. Or on the upper left, this is an architectural form we don't even have in the West. It's a Watertown gallery. It's public space in the form of a linear gallery along a canal or a river with public benches and doorways into apartments and into stores. I don't know what that type's even called, but it's found in southern China. It's a really interesting and really unknown cultural phenomenon. And then, of course, the lower right, I was just seeing things like this, traditional container design. So it was just an amazing thing to see vernacular traditions continuing in modern China. And also I was struck by how the Chinese Communist Party is very supportive of ethnic minorities having their rights, their culture. They can have as many kids as they want, all of it. And in no place more dramatically and movingly, I would say, than in Lijiang, which is a World UNESCO Heritage Site that was built by the Naxi minority. This is a matriarchal society, and I think it's matriarchal. But the architecture is different, preserved these public spaces. It's just wonderful to see traditional things like that is being preserved. Mike, one short question.
No, just one quick comment. The UNESCO World Heritage Sites, Italy has 53 sites. China is second with 52.
How interesting. I don't even know the other 51 sites. I should. The other thing that I found kind of interesting was that kind of nostalgia for the Mao era, and this is sort of pre-Cultural Revolution, or sort of a kind of upbeat. I almost compare these political posters from that era to something like MGM musical movie posters. There's something of that upbeat feeling about rah, rah, rah. China's just doing great. We're going to overcome anything. The gentleman back there raising his fist, this is about the Tongshan Earthquake, which took place in 1976. And I don't know, 10,000 people died or something. It was terrible. And that poster is saying, we're going to, no problem. How many?
250,000 people died.
In the Tongshan earthquake? So that's what that poster is about. And I collected some of these posters. So I was just really struck by that phenomenon from that era. In 2008, I just happened to be on assignment for the firm in Beijing when they had I guess a routine dust storm. Is that what I can call it? Is it routine? But so I don't know what happens to dust storms in the era of climate change. Do they go up or do they go down, or who knows what's going to happen? But already there was sort of climatic inconvenience in the capital of the world's emerging second superpower. So it's an interesting environment for Beijing to be located in. I've just often thought, well, why not move? I mean, or something like that. But of course, that's been proposed and scuttled before. The irony of the picture is that they're hovering over the poster on the entrance to the Forbidden City of Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. Hovering right over it is this American flag held as a symbol by this Chinese tour guide with his Chinese tour group. I mean, it's just sort of a random little ironic thing to see that juxtaposition. But one of my moments that brought the world of Taiwan and the world of China together was when the Chinese landscape architecture firm that I was working for, opening the office in Boston, entered a competition in Taiwan and won it. We won first place in this public open space, ecological open space, greenway corridor design for Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan. And to accept the award, I asked my colleague from Taiwan to please help me translate my speech into idiomatic Chinese, because I can speak a little Chinese, I learned a little bit. I can say, well, hui jiang yi jian jian zhongwen, but I really can't speak any Chinese at all. And, but I was reading the script, and it made me feel great that finally I could say, thank you guys from back in the day, those guys up there, I'm back, and what you did for me, I'll never forget. And we're just honored to be here to accept this award. Meanwhile, I was working on a book that under the auspices of Ma Xiaowei's firm, Ager, and I was just talking to regular folks in public open space, getting a sense of how people use open space, making friends, like a guy that used to build airplanes in Guangzhou, in Shanghai back in the 1940s. Just people like that I would just talk to and collect ideas. And eventually a book came out, bilingual, in Chinese and English, that Ma Xiaowei said, okay, Tom, it's your baby. And I said, no, it's our baby. And so we featured work by the firm, but this is a best practices manual, and I've got a copy here for people to see afterwards. But what I want to point out is it's bilingual. And the idea of translating what I had to say into Chinese meant that I had to have a Chinese colleague basically work with me line by line to make sure that we got it right, because, and I learned a lot from my Chinese colleagues about the differences in our languages, which is that our language tends to be more direct, and Chinese language, and I wonder if everybody here would agree with me, can sometimes be more suggestive and ambiguous. And so you have to get beyond the suggestive and ambiguous when you're talking about design and what's really needed. And so I want to make sure that happened in the thing. But I got to go on a book tour all over China, and I got to mention to people that, well, as I showed you in this last image, that's Central Park in New York, Frederick Olmstead. So I'm in China on a book tour talking about Frederick Olmstead, who very few Chinese landscape architects realize, before he became a landscape architect, was a sailor who went to Guangzhou, Canton, in 1843. He visited there, and he was able to sneak out into the city. You're not supposed to, but he got out there among regular Chinese. He came back with this idea. He said he was so well treated, and he just liked the atmosphere that he was seeing there. He called it civility. And so he went off later to see the parks in Paris, to see the parks in London, to go to Birkenhead Park in Liverpool, and come back and became a landscape architect. But he built people's parks, and in the back of his mind, he would also realize that what I'm really trying to do is bring people together and create a sense of civility, of just ordinary people interacting with each other in public space. That was Olmsted's idea, and it became the direct inspiration of all the people's parks that emerged in China during the mid-20th century. So, China has come a long way since those earlier bunch of images that I showed you, and I think nothing demonstrates more clearly that than this one image that I took in Guangzhou, where I'm at the top of the equivalent of the Eiffel Tower, and you wouldn't even think you were at the top of a building. You'd think you were in some public park, but no, you're like 50 stories off the ground. There's gondola rides up there. People are having wedding shoots up there. It's not even flat. It goes uphill. It like spirals up there, looking over Guangzhou, the city that reached out to the west before any of the other cities in China, and about which I'm about to talk a lot more in the backstory, because all during this time when I was involved in China, I had increasingly come to realize that I've got to dig back to my own roots, because I knew that there was this guy named John Bryant, of a firm called Bryant and Sturgis. But it took me a long time to realize, and this is painted by Healy. He's a pretty good artist. He painted the big Daniel Webster picture in Faneuil Hall. It took me a long time to realize that Bryant and Sturgis, what that kind of firm that was. It was a China trade firm, and they were partnered with the Perkins brothers. That's like Thomas Henderson Perkins of Perkins Institute fame. Perkins brothers, Bryant and Sturgis were, as an alliance, were the largest China trade firm in the old China trade in America. So I learned that John Bryant, my ancestor, born in 1780, his father lost his arm in the Revolution. At age 50, John has to say goodbye to his family. He's got 50 cents in his pocket, and he trudges all the way from the Springfield Armory, where his father was the head of it, to Boston to try to find a job. And he gets a job in a bookstore, but a year later he says, no, I'm not doing that anymore. Books are great, but ships are even better. And he got himself on a ship, and it's the beginning of his career as a supercargo in trading ships. But it was not until 1809 that he got to go to China as a supercargo. So what you're seeing here, I didn't even know about this until like 2015, when I went to the PBS museum. I said, oh my God, you're kidding me. This is his handwriting, my ancestor's handwriting. It's perfect. Every log, this is a log. You keep it on the ship, and it doesn't matter if there's a typhoon going on outside or not. You're going to keep the records of that day. Well, the day that he's keeping the records of here, there's so much that happened to him this particular day that he's writing sideways because there's just not enough room in this thing. Let me tell you what happened to him this day. They've gone all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, all the way around, and they're coming up through the Sunda Straits down towards Indonesia, and they are approaching the mouth of the Pearl River to come into Guangzhou. And they've already passed Macau, where they've gotten the Chinese handlers who have to board the ship and pilot them up towards Guangzhou. It's quite complicated how those rivers work. When they get attacked by pirates in the middle of a squall. So they're being attacked by something like a typhoon. It's just pouring rain. They're being attacked by pirates. They're trying to go below to get their muskets to fire, but they all get drenched. The powder is no good in the rain. So they're being attacked by pirates. The pirates start, these are pirates based on mainland China, and everybody hates them. And by the end of this thing, they're going to be dead or soon after. But this is the most famous pirate attack of China traders that's been recorded. There are various sources that I found where this is the one. There were many pirate attacks, but this is the one where a lot of bad stuff happened. They made it into Guangzhou, and I think within a month or so, the head of the pirate attacks of this fleet of pirates was captured, and he was, so we say, subjected to the death by 1,000 cuts. And that story made the rounds in early New England maritime history. But I didn't even know that John Bryant was there. I knew that the Forbeses were there. I knew that Bill Sturgis was there, but I didn't know that John Bryant was there. But he was. So that was amazing. So this is where they were headed. This is the area called the Shisanhong, but it's the 13 factories district in Guangzhou, in Canton. These are the offices where they did the trade, and you can see the flags flying of the U.S., I think Sweden, Britain, and France showing up there. So there are 13 European and plus America, 12 plus European plus America nations doing trade. And what do they want? They want tea, they want silk, they want porcelain, things of that sort. And what do they have to offer? Not a whole lot. Some silver, but they got opium. And that's the unfortunate reality of the trade, that in order to open up trade in China, opium seemed to open the door. And that was an unfortunate fact, but that was the way it was. So this was the destination. There was an island downstream where all the goods were unloaded, but here is where the supercargoes, John Bryant, the sea captains, interacted with the Chinese merchants to cut deals, to get the tea out and get the sea otter pelts and so on, as well as the silver and opium in. And so over the next, this is 1809, so over the next 50 years, John Bryant partners with the guy that was on the other ship in that pirate attack named Bill Sturgis, who was a sea captain, and forms a lifelong partnership on a handshake called Bryant and Sturgis. And ultimately they own 60 ships like this, the most famous of which appear in a very famous American historical work called 2 Years Before the Mast by Richard Henry Dana, who became a maritime lawyer. The two ships that he was on in those 2 years were both Bryant and Sturgis ships. And where they came in Boston looked like this. This is a stereo view, so it's the same thing twice, of Commercial Wharf on the Boston waterfront, and Bryant and Sturgis offices were at number 1. And that building is rock solid, it still stands, capturing that moment. Bryant also had brothers, and he got them in on the trade. His younger brother, David, was a pretty good artist. His logbook has that drawing, that painting on the left there of what I think is a Bryant and Sturgis ship in this moment, with an interesting landform behind it, which I really wanted to see. It's famous. It's called Human, or Boca Tigris, or Tiger Mouth. It's often just described as Boca Tigris, or however you pronounce that. So I went to look at it back in 2015, and that's what it looks like. So he got it pretty well right. I was just amazed to see that. So I mentioned opium. There was a whole island devoted to the storage of opium that was well off the shore, way towards the mouth of the Pearl River. And you would think there was nothing bad going on there to look at this painting. But it was just sort of a matter of fact, matter of doing business at that moment in the evolution of our relationship between China and the West. The gentleman that everybody liked to do business with, Americans, was a guy named Huqua, or Wu Bingjian. Everybody did business with him on a handshake. He was allegedly the richest guy in the world at the time. He was a man of absolute integrity. Everybody wanted to do business with him. And Wu Bingjian, likewise, wanted to do a lot of business with the Forbeses. He liked them a lot, and he actually entrusted $1 million of equivalent of capital back at that moment to be invested in, guess what? America. More on that in a second. But anyway, Bryant and Sturgis, the supercargo kid who used to be a 15-year-old with 15 in his pocket, now looks like that. He's wearing clothes that his father couldn't have imagined ever wearing himself. The guy on the right is Bill Sturgis, who was a sea captain, raised by sea captains on Cape Cod. He's the guy that gave Sturgis Library to the town of Barnstable in Cape Cod, if anybody knows what I'm talking about. But it's like the oldest public library building in the country because it's a 17th century house that he decided to save and give to them. So this firm has been around forever. It's evolving from just trading in China, trading in Europe, on the Pacific Northwest and other parts of the globe, to investing in American infrastructure. So by the age of the clipper ship, a clipper ship advertising card might appear with the name John Bryant on it, because he's kind of like a thing from back in the day, but he's well past his prime. But anyway, there's a ship named for him. Meanwhile, Chinese capital is being invested in America, and some of the first investors in American railroads formed their capital, won their capital, obtained their capital by being China traders, doing business in China. So one of the connections, sort of ironically, is in Canton, Mass. Canton being the first town in America named for Guangzhou, named for Canton in 1799. But anyway, a railroad connecting Boston and Canton and crosses over the Neponset River or whatever on a it was the longest one at the time. The original board of directors, the original capital came from Bryant and Sturgis and others. And Paul Revere had his factory out there as well. So there's a connection between this Canton and the China trade money. But railroads are being built with Chinese capital everywhere. And I mentioned that Wu Bingjian Huqua had invested $1 million or plus in America. There's proof of that on the walls in Boston of the J.M. Forbes company. This is the original, it says Russell and Company. I mentioned them earlier. They're the China trade firm. This is a bunch of money being returned to Huqua's family. He invests in 1842 or so, 1837. So 40 years later or so, 30 whatever years later, 1874, money is being returned to the Wu family in Guangzhou. So, of course, in the fullness of time, the Wu family goes from being the richest family in the world to pretty much losing it all by the time certainly by the time of the Cultural Revolution, for sure. So these railroads that began, like the Boston and Providence with China trade money, you get Bryant and Sturgis and J.M. Forbes, that Forbes family, investing in a kind of Midwestern railroad called the Michigan Central Railroad in 1846. And by 1857, Forbes, not the Bryant Sturgis, but Forbes it joins the board of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which is now known as Burlington Northern, or it's one of the great American railroads. But as you can see, the thread from China leads us to these great infrastructure investments in building up the American West. Meanwhile, in Boston, and over the past 10 or 15 years, I developed a kind of milestone timeline of the Boston-China connection. We haven't got time to do too many, but I'm just going to share two with you. One is this image. Now, this image shows the first introduction of water, public water supply, through aqueducts that come through Wellesley, the Cochituate aqueducts that come from Lake Cochituate in Natick. That was the first public water supply, 1847. As a college, I wrote my of the public water supply system and how it could be used for recreation and stuff like that, which meant that I was going to become a landscape architect. But I didn't realize at the time that in that image, hiding right next to Daniel Webster in his stovepipe hat there, is an image of a Chinese gentleman. This is only pointed out to me by someone in the China Historical Society in Boston, I believe. Somebody pointed it out to me. With more research, I found out who this person is. He is someone named, well, it's hard to pronounce his name. I don't know how to pronounce his name. It says Ung Ar Showi, but he called himself Charles. He was brought over the year before this, in 1847, by a sea captain. He was born in Guangzhou. And he decides to open a very cross-cultural shop, serving not just Chinese tea, but coffee. So it's a coffee tea shop, and this is before the Civil War. So he goes on to, he marries, as I say there, he marries, I guess you can't read it, but he marries a woman named Louisa Hentz, and he has kids, and he lives, he has a good, comfortable life in his newfound country. Meanwhile, this is what really blew me away, and if you'll pardon me for going down to Connecticut, but to show this image of somebody who served in the 1st Connecticut Regiment during the American Civil War. Now, who knew that up to 50 Civil War soldiers were born in China? It's kind of interesting. I mean, I'm a Civil War history buff, but I was just blown away to find out that, of course, there are Chinese in uniforms fighting in the American Civil War. Why not? So we enlarge our sense of the diversity of what makes up all these pivotal moments in our story. So in 2014, I was approached by a young entrepreneur named Colin Lynn, by way of another Lynn, my wife Lynn, whom she'd met through the Harvard Business School and some. But he was an entrepreneur that wanted to do a program to celebrate the first direct American attack, which took place as soon as the revolution ended in 1784, when a Boston-built ship called the Empress of China sailed, and funded by Robert Morris in Philadelphia, sails out of New York Harbor towards China and drops anchor on August 27th, 1784. 230 years later, this entrepreneur said, let's do it, help me organize a celebration, sending a delegation from Boston to Guangzhou. And so we got that done. And we had a delegation including representatives, we got John Barros there, and Rich Elam. Winston Lowe is a Chinese entrepreneur in Boston. Hunter Richard, also from the state, at the city level. Rob Forbes, a direct descendant of Robert Bennett Forbes, who shook the hands of who, and myself, having a wonderful time at a ribbon-cutting ceremony celebrating this incredible moment. And various books were published, and I've brought over there on the side table, if you've got time after, you'll see what happened in terms of publishing after that event. But I said, I got to talk about the history of my ancestor, and I said, well, you know, Hukwa Wubingjian, you know, it would be really cool if we could find some descendant of his. Does anybody know if we can find any descendants of his? And the next day, so Hukwa's descendant meets the descendant of Robert Bennett Forbes. So the two China traders on both sides of a transaction from the 1840s, descendants, great-grandparents, I don't know. They're shaking hands across from the Guangzhou City Hall. I got to tell you, it was just the coolest thing ever. I'm glad I opened my big mouth to make that happen. Anyway, so we went out to a Starbucks after that. And yeah, and Wu Lingli, the descendant of Wu Bingjian, took out his laptop and showed us pictures of his great-grandfather's incredible garden that was across the river from Guangzhou and stuff like that. And it just made me think, we've got to keep telling more of these stories somehow. We've got to dramatize, we could dramatize these two family stories and interweave them over time. Something like that's got to happen. A step in that right direction occurred very shortly thereafter when Central China Television, which has an English language channel and Chinese language channels, sent a film crew over to the U.S. to do something called the Maritime Silk Road. And they'd seen me talking at that Guangzhou event, and they saw Rob Forbes there. And so they got a film crew over here and filmed in the Forbes House Museum. And there you can see, in the background, on the wall of the parlor of what used to be the Forbes family house, not a museum, it was a house, surrounded by Chinese export furniture, you can see a portrait of Wu Bingjian, of Huqua, in the place of honor, because that's how much Huqua meant to the Forbes family, just about everything. And the film crew also came over to my house here in Wellesley and did a brief shoot of me talking to our daughter, and in the background, the portrait of John Bryant on the wall, which got incorporated in this kind of really cool movie, a television documentary that aired in China. And I tried to get it over here, but it didn't really get to happen. So I'm at the end of my talk, but I just want to give you the takeaways, big takeaways. There are many Chinas. None of us are ever going to know them all, but they're all worth knowing. The Central Communist Party and the people are two different worlds. So I think the membership in the Communist Party is a minority of Chinese people. In fact, Colin Lin is a member of another party that is allowed, another political party that is allowed to do its thing because it's not a threat to the Communist Party. They have some party diversity in China. I would say they dig Chinese people in mainland China, this goes for Taiwan too, deeper into our culture, into theirs, and that's a mistake. We ought to try to think about that. I don't know if it'll ever be true again, but it was certainly true back when I got to do it, that there's no way to understand the U.S. than to spend time in China. You're at the opposite side of the world, but you're getting a really interesting perspective on your own world, and you also learn, what's worth whining about and what you should just stop whining about. I would say Chinese people want in, even now, and I'd be curious as to whether I have consensus on that. Still want in to this crazy country we call the United States. I think that Venn diagram that I talked about earlier, China and America, I think it's at the moment maybe, but I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's going to continue. It's good to be reminded that the China trade had a major part in building up America. I think the shared history is alive and can bring us closer together. And I would just say only connect, because we are more connected than we realize. Like things like fireworks, which we have to say, we wouldn't have help from. And I was just amazed to see the Statue of Liberty in Guangzhou, surviving the Cultural Revolution. This is in a park celebrating the martyrs of that revolution I mentioned earlier, Sun Yat-sen's revolution. Lady Liberty in China. Thank you. Well, thank you for bearing with me. I think I ran over, but I'm happy to take questions. Or comments. I mean, if there's anything you would say, well, that was completely, that was.
Quick thing, you showed a picture of the Statue of Liberty at the end that survived that Cultural Revolution, but you never alluded to the massacre in Tiananmen Square in 1989. You want to say anything about that?
I couldn't allude to that, sure. There's a lot I didn't say about the politics, because I'm at the level of what's it like for, how is China evolving, how is Taiwan evolving, what direction are we going in? But I could get more political. But yes, we went to Beijing in 1988. Then 1989 happens. That was a disaster, and we're all familiar with the image of the tank man. And we also know that in China you're not allowed to see any of that stuff. I also said that in Taiwan they've gotten over this feeling of not talking about the past and they're starting to talk about it. I'm going to be a long-term optimist and say that I think ultimately China will probably do more of that as well. I mean, I don't know. I think it's all to the good to do that and to just understand that. But we're in a moment now where everybody's is angry about everything. So I think it'll have to wait until we all calm down. But yes, there was a massacre there. And let me also say that I wish Ma Xiaowei, whose wife is here in the front row today, were here with us, but he's at the landscape architecture firm that he founded in Taiwan. He's managing that during these months. He'll be back later. I wish he were here to be with us because he witnessed the Tiananmen massacre aftermath. He saw what was lying outside the hospital doors, and that's all I'll say about that. Yeah.
Sort of started it, but what really, where is your interest? I mean, you've spoken about it so, eloquently and shared a lot of great information, but what brought you to doing this? To this presentation, or, you lived in China, what is your reason to connect and what you've learned and what you've seen and how you feel to this audience?
Because I believe that these stories are important to tell, and I believe that living in Wellesley right now are many people from China, and we ought to be a community that connects on the basis of all our stories, whether they're shared, or we ought to share our different stories, because here we are living in the same moment. And we have a lot to learn from each other. And we in America should stop whining about a lot of stuff, because we've had it good. And so I think there's a lot more that could be said in a positive way. So this is not my idea to give this talk, but I said absolutely I'll do it. This came from the library, and John, you were involved with sort of getting the word out there that there's really a great community of people who come from Asia, come from China, mainland China, some from Taiwan, and all these stories are fascinating, and we ought to be sharing them. I mean, I don't know why we can't. So if this is like the beginning of that, I'll say, okay, that was worth it.
Tom, not to give you more research to do, but I've seen that picture of the Chinese Civil War soldier. I believe there's a connection there to a school for Chinese young men that was set up before the Civil War in Hartford, Connecticut. And I don't have the details on that. You may have seen it, but I think there's another connection, as you would say, between, again, Hartford, Connecticut and China.
Yeah.
That may have led to that young man and some of the others who served in the Civil War.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, let's talk about that later, please.
That was like,
等一下好不好? Okay.
can you talk more about your great aunt?
Talk a bit more about what?
About your great aunt?
Oh, about my great aunt. Well, I had two great aunts that were in China. So Helen Payne Kimball was an artist, and she and her husband, they got married just before that. They went on a kind of elaborate honeymoon, and they were going all over Asia and took photographs. I've got many albums of them, and I've got contact sheets of them. But so she was just fascinated with China. I think she took more pictures in China than she took in the Philippines or Japan or all the other places she went. And then she did all these charcoal drawings, many charcoal drawings. She never had any children. She had health issues, multiple sclerosis, basically. And she died in the year before I was born, in her 60s. So her life was not easy, but she loved my dad. And so he ended up with a lot of those wonderful charcoal drawings. And she also shared a lot of her photographs with National Geographic. And so they were published in National Geographic back in the 1920s. And she colorized a lot of her images. So she did magic lantern, colorized positives, presentations, things of that sort before she had to give it up. But she was quite an extraordinary relative for me to have. And I had another great aunt on my mother's side who was actually a missionary educator who was based in what is now called Wuhan. But it was called Hankou and Wu something else. I can't remember the names. There were two separate cities on both sides of the river that have combined. And I've got photographs of hers with all of her young Chinese students and so on from her time in China. And she was there a little bit later in the 19-teens and 20s. But so I knew about China. She loved the color purple. And I think she had so many clothes that she had bought in China with something about the color purple. The thing she had was purple. And it all went back to her time in China. She never married. So these two great aunts with no kids, but I'm their, what do you call it? Their symbolic heir or whatever. So any other questions or comments? Ben, I interrupted you.
Oh, yes, I was, just follow up the question, gentleman mentioned. There was like, I think I was trying to do a Google search, like early 1854, earlier than that, 1820, there was a group, I think 400 Chinese boys.
Oh, that many?
Yeah,
Okay.
were sent to
Hartford?
China, to Hartford, and to study.
From China to
From
Hartford?
China, yeah,
Right.
that was the first
That's what I thought. Okay.
a Chinese student. I think unfortunately they left, right? My friends know. Unfortunately, they didn't finish. Well, some of them stayed here, including one of the gentlemen graduated from Yale, and there are quite a number of them finished, but most of them went back. It's probably called the missionary exchange program.
That would make sense, of course, because I think it was a Christian school, yeah.
Interesting. I'd like to know more later.
I do want to mention, I think this year is the 200-year anniversary for the Olmstead.
This is the 200th birthday year of Olmstead. That is quite correct. Yeah, they've had some ceremonies about that early in the year. So, Mr. Greco.
Tom, you and I have talked a lot about the subject that you
Yeah.
over the years. My first trip to China was in 1986. I've been president of the Massachusetts Bar Association. I'm a lawyer. I led a group of 30 lawyers, judges, spouses, 22-day trip. We covered so many cities. I was just so fascinated by the culture and the beauty of China. Fast forward to 2005, when I was president of the American Bar Association. I had several trips to Asia, two to China, and I met with government leaders. We talked about human rights violations. We talked about all kinds of things.
Yeah.
2012, I was invited to teach as a visiting professor at Peking University School of Transnational Law in Shenzhen. What I've really enjoyed so much is that the students that I've been teaching after 10 years, I've recommended a dozen of them to Harvard Law School's graduate program, PhD program, LLM program.
Yeah.
And they've all done beautifully. They've distinguished themselves. And then, since I'm a lawyer, and the other part of what I'm doing, have been doing, is recommending to judges in Massachusetts, federal court and state court, interns. And to give you an idea of the caliber of these students, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, Ralph Gantz, who passed away sadly 2 years ago, I persuaded him to take an intern. And at the end of her internship, he wrote up an evaluation of her performance. And it was stunning what he said about this young woman. And she is just one of about 15 interns that I've been able to bring to Boston. So, just to let you know that there are various avenues. Some of us, many of us, can do what you've been talking about, the growing connection.
Yeah.
Because these students not only want to come to be taught in the U.S., they want to stay in the U.S.
Yeah.
Many of them have stayed. They couldn't take the bar exam until 2 years ago. And the students that I recommended as interns or to Harvard and Yale and other law schools, they are now
Excellent.
So
Wonderful.
little by little, I'm trying to do
You are.
my little bit.
Oh, you're doing more than I ever did. I brought some books that kind of the arc of my talk over there from Taiwan from the 1970s through that commemorative event from 2014 over there. If anybody on your way out just wants to flip them open and look at them, they're kind of interesting. But unless there's any more questions, oh wait, we do have a couple more.
Just got one last thing I was going to say. I know you've read it, but there's a new book on a collaboration between Frederick Olmstead and H.H. Richardson, of course, who was focused largely here in Boston. And I think you've read it. I know you've read it. 'Cause
It's
you and I
good,
talked about
yeah.
it, but I think that's something. I think it's called Architects of the American Landscape. That is, no, I don't get a commission on it, but it's a very interesting book if you're
Yeah.
interested in Mr. Olmstead.
I don't think he talks.
Richardson.
He doesn't talk enough about China in there, though. That's the one.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, not much. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, I have a question. I think the material you presented has a very significant historical aspect of it. Now, my question is, how would the general public know all these background events that you presented, so they have a better education or understanding for the general public, especially Wellesley, between the two countries?
I'm sorry. I'm having trouble understanding the thread of that. I got really bad hearing, and can you rephrase that? You're talking about.
About what have been happened in respect to what you've been talking about, all the material, I think is terrific, historical aspect of it. Now, how would the general public understand, especially the Wellesley resident or people in this country, and what has been transpired in trade, culture, and then so that we have a better understanding between China, Taiwan, and the United States.
So are you asking me how we can create better understanding between these two worlds using things like I'm?
Educate, let people know about that.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really.
Rather than coming to a lecture or
Yeah.
presentation in here.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that.
Only a handful of us know about it.
Yeah. That's a very fraught, important question, and I can't come up with a quick answer to that, but it clearly needs to be done. It needs to be embedded in our curriculum more. We've just gotten to the level of platitudes and so on, and we just have to dig down into the details more, and show a little bit more understanding and tolerance, I guess, for different cultural takes on things as to what makes things up, and stop grinding our usual axes. But it's going to take time. But I think slowly the diversity wins over a kind of monolithic sense of reality, and that's a good thing, because it's all about connecting across and getting ideas from new places. That's how creativity happens. And we're the luckiest nation on earth to be as diverse as we are, and we should start realizing it. But anyway, that's just me sounding off. You all?
Tom, thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, so that was fun.
Yeah, that was really good.
Well,
I didn't know all those informations.
Yeah. Sorry about that.